Hi, well, welcome everyone to another RIS interview, where we bring you the story behind the cutting-edge research that made it into our journal, the Review of International Studies, also known as RIS. Today, I am absolutely delighted to be talking to Dr. Bryan Mabee, who is a senior lecturer at the School of Global Studies at the University of Gothenburg. Welcome, Bryan.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Bryan has an article in the Review of International Studies on the international politics of truth, see Wright Mills and the sociology of the international. As I mentioned, welcome, Bryan, and very much, huge congratulations on the article.
Thanks.
We're going to get straight onto it. So let me start by asking you a little bit about yourself and your academic journey. How did you end up becoming interested in this area of research?
Well, I've had a long-standing interest in historical sociology of international relations, which has framed most of my research to date. Work in that area on globalization, security, US power, and my interest in C. Wright Mills came out of that, and mainly through his reflections on social science in a book from 1959 called The Sociological Imagination, but also, importantly, his work on militarism in another book, The Power Elite, which came out in 1956. And I'd long planned to do something on this book, The Power Elite, and what it means for international relations, but it's taken quite a while for me to kind of think about what that would be. And in revisiting his work, I ended up moving more into the realm of intellectual history, which I've always been interested in, and it's, as you'll know, has become an important recent area of IR research, but it's not something I've really done as part of my own research. So the interest in Mills came out of my previous work, but the approach is kind of new for me. So it's a bit of a new direction.
So interesting. Could you give us a sort of brief outline of the article and its main arguments and ideas?
Yeah, the article is mainly an attempt to sketch out what Mills's views on international relations are. Because in the past, he's mainly been seen by Mills scholars as kind of polemical in terms of how he approaches international relations and kind of undersubstantiated in some sense, that his other more sociological work is seen as more grounded in theory and things like that. And what I wanted to claim is that there actually is a more substantial theoretical approach to the international in his work that I think would be of interest to IR scholars, both from more intellectual history perspective, but also go a little more tentatively in terms of thinking about present day IR theory. And I basically try and make the case through two moves. The first looks back at earlier work that Mills did on the question of international relations, mainly in the 1940s, and links it more clearly with his theoretical work that he does on sociology, and especially political sociology, through people like Max Weber, Karl Mannheim, and Franz Neumann. And then the second part is to link that older work to the more polemical work that he did in the later 1950s on international relations and sketch out what I refer to in the article as the international politics of truth.
So you've talked a little bit about Mills there, but who was he and what was his intellectual and political background?
Well, he was a quite influential and prominent American sociologist whose main work came out in the 1940s and 1950s. He started off doing work on the sociology of knowledge and then moved on to write a very prominent series of books on social stratification in the US and big changes that he saw as happening sort of mid-century about labor, about the middle classes, which culminated in a book that became, I think, had more broad influence in political science as well, called The Power Elite, which came out in 1956. But also in the context of all of that, he was a quite prominent and outspoken critic of academic sociology and social sciences in the US, thinking it had basically taken a wrong turn with what he described as a kind of over-abstracted grand theory on the one hand and over-empirical quantitative work on the other hand. And his book, The Sociological Imagination, was a critique of those trends, which also came out in the late 1950s. And this book, just to give a sense, for those who might not know him that well, in 1999 was voted by the International Sociological Association as the second most important book of the 20th century for sociology, ahead of other sort of giants of sociology like Bourdieu and Talcott Parsons and Norbert Elias and others. So he's seen within the discipline as hugely prominent, though he is quite controversial. And this is partially due to his quite aggressive style. I mean, some of that comes out, I think, in the excerpts that I have from his work, the way he presents things, but also that he really was pushing against a number of trends within academia at the time. But he also was a quite radical critic of US and world politics. And though his politics were quite eclectic, I mean, he's sometimes seen as a kind of quasi-Marxist, but he wasn't very doctrinaire. And there were loads of those who didn't feel he was Marxist enough. And he was also been seen as anti-communist as well. So he fits in very strangely. And I think in some ways that's why his critique has remained a lot of power, because people can read whatever they want into it in various ways as well. And he became a really inspiring figure for the New Left in the 1960s, both in the US and the UK, but also internationally. And he had a very prominent article in 1960 in the New Left Review called A Letter to the New Left, which was really kind of catalyzing in this regard. But he died in 1962 at the age of 45, so quite young. And there was a real sense of loss in terms of work to come. I mean, in terms of his work as an academic, even though at that time he'd published something like 9 books already and hundreds of essays, both in academic journals and in the popular press and journals and things like that. So he was a really towering figure and controversial figure in sociology and American public life.
So interesting. What an interesting figure. What is the exactly the international politics of truth?
Well, this is my description of what I think Mills is kind of up to. And he did develop this idea of the politics of truth as a way of conceptualizing the role of intellectual in society. And it overlapped with a number of other sort of figures who did similar things about critiquing elite knowledge and things like this and speaking truth to power. But in Mills, he tried to push this a bit further, that it wasn't just about speaking truth to establish power, because there's also a sense in Mills's work that truth was or is constructed in various ways. And so there was a need to challenge established beliefs with different regimes of truth or different reimaginings. So this process of reimagining what the world looked like and could look like was really crucial in his work, and gave it a slightly different flavor, I guess, than some of the other approaches that were kind of similar. But what I argue in the article is that we can see an international politics of truth in Mills's work, which concerns attempts to contest elite knowledge of the international, especially the idea that military necessity that we see in sort of strategic language of the Cold War around nuclear weapons, but also a critique of political realism that's quite prominent in his work, even though he doesn't refer specifically to any sort of leading realist figures. But the critique in Mills's work as an international politics of truth was about this elite knowledge as a guiding principle of international policy and how we might find alternatives to that.
And does he provide something distinctive to IR theory, would you say?
This is always a difficult question when you're looking at these past figures, because especially if you're doing an intellectual history approach that's trying to contextualize them in their times. But I think there are interesting overlaps with recent critical theories of IR, and especially those that focus on things that, like, for example, the importance of hierarchy over anarchy in the international system. Because in Mills's substantive work on the international, he refers a lot to looking at the imperial power of the US and the Soviet Union and theories of development that align with that. And so I think he fits quite squarely with approaches that want to criticize the emphasis of anarchic international relations. But also, I think he's in line with those that want to show the centrality of the social construction of knowledge in the discipline as well in various ways. And so this idea around a politics of truth, I think, is quite central to that. And there's interesting ways in which that overlaps and maybe adds to ways that's theorized now. But I think there's also quite a distinctive element with his ideas about the engagement of the public in the creation of knowledge, which I didn't mention is a crucial part of his idea of the sociological imagination, that he saw the social scientists, that in the social sciences and intellectuals more generally, that there should be some sense of trying to show the ways in which the big problems in the world and their structures and their history actually interact with the everyday problems of people. And that this was a really important way of engaging the world and actually trying to change the world in various ways. And this idea of the necessity of intellectuals to foster a sociological imagination, I think could give something interesting to thinking about the role of international relations more publicly. I didn't say much about this in my article. I just mentioned it, not in passing, but as a kind of way of expanding out or thinking about what Mills could do, mostly in the conclusion. But I think there is something interesting there. Though those ideas might be a bit time-bound, again, there's still quite interesting way he weaves together political and sociological analysis, a critique of sort of present reality, but also a broader engagement with what he conceptualizes as the public.
Did he also engage with contemporary IR scholarship?
This is something that I really struggled with when I was looking at his work, because there seemed to be lots of overlaps with what especially realist scholars of international relations were doing at the time, even though he was quite critical of a conception of realism that he kind of created in his own way, though this seemed to be something that linked more with policymakers rather than scholarship. But the only IR scholar that he really clearly engages with citations and some discussion is E.H. Carr, which is quite a prominent one. But even there, the influence is a bit vague. There's an essay where he actually calls Carr's 20 Years Crisis. I can't remember the exact quote, but it's in the paper, the best sociological analysis of international relations. But he doesn't elaborate much on what that is or how it influences him, though he does talk about Carr a lot in a couple of places, in The Power Elite and some other ones. But I do see a lot of overlaps in his interests and influences with other IR scholars, particularly Hans Morgenthau, John Hartz, but I've not yet found any evidence of this. But it's something I'm working on for future papers. And one thing that I didn't get to do in the course of the research was actually visit the Mills archives which are based at the University of Texas in Austin. It was just kind of impossible for all sorts of reasons. But I'm hoping that maybe there might be some more once I'm able to do that someday. So yeah. Because there are a lot of overlaps of interest and influence, and in terms of the mapping out some intellectual overlaps in the history of the discipline and outsiders to the discipline, I think it'd be really interesting.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Okay, well, for those who are listening to this interview who want to know more about your article, what would you say are the main takeaways of it?
Well, I think I've said a bit already about the idea about contemporary IR theory and some things that could be gained, but I think there's a couple of other useful points. I think it's one of the things that it demonstrates is that in the value of looking at so-called non-canonical thinkers of the international, that a lot of the intellectual history that's been done so far, with some really prominent exceptions though as well, has tended to look at some of the big thinkers in IR and how they've been contextualized in their era. But I think in looking at non-canonical thinkers, we can see different ways that they frame important substantive theoretical concerns that maybe challenge the way the discipline's done it, or do it in different kinds of ways, or maybe even have overlapping senses of what can be done. And obviously it's interesting historically to see how other public figures and figures in other disciplines were maybe engaging with international issues, but could also have relevance for thinking about the international today. But I think also, and more particular to Mills, is that his distinctive sociological position, that not only was a key figure in sociology, but had, I think, interesting sociological insights to politics, society, to thinking about the world more generally, can give us something different as well, that links, I think, with present traditions, especially in international political sociology or the historical sociology of international relations, but also with what I'd call a pragmatist twist. I haven't mentioned this in our interview at all, but one of the traditions that Mills draws on is American pragmatism, especially that of George Herbert Mead and John Dewey. And I get into that more in the article, but I think it's something that he brings that's distinctive and maybe could bring something interesting to those recent critical traditions as well.
Yeah, very, very interesting. Well, okay. Well, thank you so much for agreeing to be interviewed. I think many of our listeners will agree with me. I mean, it's extremely interesting, and I think we'd all like to learn more and read the article. So we're very grateful to you for sharing it with us here today. For those of you who are keen to learn more, you can read Bryan's full article in the First View section of the RIS website. If you are a BISA member, you can access this free of charge as part of your membership. You just need to log on to your account. If you're not a member, you might want to see if you can gain access via your institution. And while you're here, please do look at the BISA website, which is www.bisa.ac.uk. You can learn all about the association and all the wonderful benefits a BISA membership will bring you. So please do take a look. And with that, thank you very much, Bryan, again.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you. And it's been a real pleasure. Goodbye.
Thank you.